So welcome to the start of this advanced track. You remember from the course outline, we get 3 tracks in this course, and this is the first module which belongs to the so-called advanced track, which really just means it's an entry point in case you skip the last module or modules. And that's also important. If you didn't skip these modules, you can skip this video. You can stop here and continue with the rest of the module, of course. So what is our current state? What did we do so far? Attached to this video, you find the project, the course project, in its latest version. So how we built it, what we added up to this point. We're building this example fictional web hosting company's page from a design or from a CSS styling perspective only. And this is what we got. We got our starting page. The packages page is working. Customers and start hosting is not working yet. We'll add this throughout the course later in later modules. And in this module, we'll work on this background image, on images in general, to be precise. Now here's the code for that. This is what you find attached. As you can see, we got this index.html file, which holds the HTML code of our starting page. We use a bunch of classes and ID selectors in there. We use the selectors, to be precise, in the main CSS and shared CSS files. Shared CSS contains the code for our header, for example, and for our footer. So for things we share amongst our different pages. The packages page is the only other page we got thus far. But here we also import the shared file, as you can see. And then we got the page-specific CSS files, packages CSS for the packages page, main CSS for our main homepage here. And there we have a bunch of CSS declarations and rules which, well, turn our HTML code into this page here. And definitely feel free to go through all that code to totally understand what's going on. We also got that image which we're using, and that images folder which holds the general background of our plans we got on that second page here. So this is everything we got up to this point. Again, dive into the code, explore it so that we're all on the same page. And with that, let's dive into this module on backgrounds and images. Welcome to this module on backgrounds and images. Now that Manuel walked us through the position property and how we can use it to position elements on our page, I want to dive back into some important visuals of our page. Images and backgrounds. Pretty much any website has images and backgrounds, and it's important that you know how you can style these things. Specifically, what we'll have a look at in this module is how we can actually use that background property, because there's more than just a color or an image we can set on it. We'll then dive in detail into how you can style images and background images. And we'll also have a look at gradients, what they are and how you can create both linear and radial gradients and use them on your page. And finally, towards the end, I'll also dive into filters, explain what they are and how you may use them. So a lot of ground to cover. Let's dive right into it, and let's start with that background image we had in our website. So back on our page, on the starting page, we have that background image here at the top. Now it doesn't look that bad, but maybe we can enhance the way it looks like. Maybe you also like this way, but I would prefer if we would see more of that woman and less of the sky. Because actually, if we have a look at our original image here, the freedom image, we see it's way more than just the top left part we're seeing right now. For that, we need to position and size it. Both can be done with the background property if you're using a background image. But that's the first thing I want to dive in. Right now, we always used background either with an image or with a solid color. We use the same notation, but background here actually is just a shorthand. We could replace the background here with background-image, URL freedom.jpg. With that, if I comment out the first line and I go back to the page and I reload it, we see the same as before, because background-image is how we actually set such an image. On the other hand, when we use a solid color, we use background-color and set this to red. And if you would now expect this color to override the image, because it was defined after it, you would be mistaken. If you reload, you see the color flash, but you also see the image. And we have to temporarily remove the image background to see the solid color. Because it turns out you can define multiple backgrounds, only one solid color though. Multiple images are possible, but we'll dive into this later in the module. And therefore, you can create both an image and a color. The image will be in front of the color though. However, here I don't want to have a color right now. Let's go back to that image and let's find out how we can actually size and position it, because this is not really the style I want to have. Now there are more background properties we can use, and for sizing, background size seems to be appropriate. Now background size takes a couple of different values. For example, you can simply set it to 100 pixels. Let's save that and let's see what this results in. If we reload, wow, we see many small images. Now each image actually has a width of 100 pixels, because if we only set one value here, this refers to the width of the image. And by default, it's then repeated. Now we can turn off that repeating or control it with background-repeat. You can set it to no repeat, to, well, don't repeat the image. Now we only got one in the top left corner. Or you set it to repeat X, to only repeat the image on the X-axis. If you now reload, you see there are plenty of images on the X-axis, but only in one row because we don't repeat it on the Y-axis. And on the other hand, there of course also is repeat Y for cases where you do want to repeat it on the Y-axis. I don't see that many use cases where you would need that, but if you do, well, that's how you do it. However, let's set this back to no repeat. And let's increase the width to, let's say, 300 pixels. Now if we reload, we got one bigger image. It doesn't fit into our container though, so this is not the solution I want to end with. Before I dive into the solution that works for us here, let me show what you can do if you set a second value here, let's say to 100 pixels. If you do that, you set the width and the height of the image. If you don't set it, the height is automatically adjusted to keep the aspect ratio. If you do set a value here, the image is forced into these dimensions, so it may very well be distorted. And if we reload here, you see it is in our case, because now the image does not respect, it does not keep its original aspect ratio, it's forced into this dimension or into this width and height we set up here. Now, besides pixel values, you can also set percentage values, like 50% for the width. Now you see, if you reload, that the image actually takes 50% of the available container width. You can also set it to 100%, of course, to take the full width. Now this already looks much better, but just for completeness sake, you could also set the height to 100% and the width to 50, let's say. And if we then have a look at this, now we again have a distorted image, but the height is now fit into the container. And if you don't want to distort it, you can set the first value to auto. Now the width will be set automatically and it will keep the aspect ratio. That, of course, as you can see, leads to the image not occupying the full container in our case, because the container happens to have a different aspect ratio in our app. And for most web projects, this will probably be the case. You rarely have a perfect fit of container and image. Now, these were a couple of solutions. Please note that in the case where we had a width of 100% and a height of auto or undefined, that the image actually takes the full width of the container. It does not overlap to the left or right, but it also does not overlap to the top and bottom, even though there, the image height does not match the container height. The image is automatically cropped. And this is also something we can control. We can control how it is cropped. Before we do that, though, let's also find out one other way of defining the background size. Besides manually setting the width and height, you get some predefined keywords. And a very useful one is cover. Cover, if you reload, essentially does the same as 100% here. So it sets the width to the container width. However, cover does not exactly do that. Cover finds out which part of your container, so width or height, is the important one to be aligned to your image. Put in other words, our image here actually has an aspect ratio where it's wider than it's high. So it has landscape mode. The same is true for our container. So 𝗧𝗢 automatically finds out that it should set the width to 100% because the height will then have some excess space, because the image, just as the container, has a height that's less than the width. If you had a portrait mode container, the opposite would be the case. Put into other words, which make this clearer, 𝗧𝗢 is a setting that will ensure that your image always fills the entire container. It will even zoom in if your image is smaller than the container. So 𝗧𝗢 is the best setting if you want to ensure that there never is any white space anywhere in your container. An alternative to this is 𝗠𝗘. 𝗠𝗘 actually ensures that the full image is visible in the container. Because right now, the image is cropped. We don't see all the parts of the image. This becomes clear if we reload with the size set to 𝗠𝗘. Now you see some additional rocks at the bottom of this image. We also see that now there is some white space on the right, because with 𝗠𝗘 what happens is that the image actually doesn't fill the entire container, because 𝗠𝗘 does not make sure that the entire container is filled, like 𝗧𝗢 does. Instead, it ensures that the entire image is possible. And if that means that there is some remaining space in the container, so be it. So 𝗠𝗘 and 𝗧𝗢 are two very useful predefined settings which you use instead of manually setting the size in many cases in reality to control how your image is displayed in the surrounding container. Now with both 𝗠𝗘 and 𝗧𝗢, we have the case that we might want to position the image. Because with 𝗧𝗢 we fill the entire container, but if you watch the rocks again, you don't see them here. Well, maybe you want to fill the entire container, but show less of the sky and more of the, well, rocks of the bottom of our image. This is something we can control with background position. So let's dive into this in the next video. We had a look at background size. Now let's position the image. And as I said, we can do this with background position. Background position has a couple of ways of using it. The simplest usage is to define a pixel value, let's say 20 pixels. If we do that and we reload, what we can see is that the image is moved to the right by 20 pixels. The first value defines the x-axis. It defines how the left edge of the image should be positioned relative to the left edge of the surrounding container. And if we set 20 pixels, this means the left edge of the image, so here where the image ends, should be positioned 20 pixels to the left edge of the container. So there is an empty space of 20 pixels. Can also define a second value of, let's say, 50 pixels. This is now the same for the top edge of the image and the top edge of the container. Now there is some white space at the top too. Now we can also use percentage values. For example, we can set 10%. Now the result might surprise you. If you reload, actually there's no white space on the left, because this now actually works a bit different. With the percentage values, you can define how much of the excess space, so of the parts of the image that do not make it into the container, how these parts should be distributed. Now regarding the width, the full image is displayed in the container. It's not cropped on either the left or the right, so we can enter whatever we want here for the first value. It will not change the way the image is displayed. So let's set it to 0%, which means the left part of the excess space, of which we have none, is perfectly aligned to the left edge of the container. However, this becomes clearer if we also set the top. The second value now again refers to the y-axis, and if we set 10% here, this means that 10% of our excess space should actually go over the top. If we reload, this will actually lead to our image being pushed down. Because, and that's something you have to know, the default, if you only set one value, is 50%. So if I set 50 and I reload, we get the exact same result as if we set no second value at all. 50% means of the parts of the image that do not fit into the container, so that are cropped off, 50% will be cropped at the bottom and 50% will be cropped at the top. If we set this to 10%, only 10% will be cropped at the top, which means that more parts are cropped at the bottom, so the image is effectively pushed down in its container. If we set this to 100% on the other hand, all the content that has to be cropped will be cropped at the top and nothing will be cropped at the bottom. So this results in the bottom edge of the image being perfectly aligned to the bottom edge of the container and everything is cropped at the top. This is how you can control the positioning. Now, manually setting this is possible, but there also is a predefined value, center. It's the same as if you set 50%, 50%. So if you set center, it's perfectly centered because it means of the parts of the image that do not fit into the container, no matter if it's on the Y or X axis, 50% will be cropped on the left and right and top and bottom, so that the center of the image is the center of the container. You can also set this to left, top for example. This means that the left part of the image, the left edge of the image, is positioned on the left edge of the container, so no cropping happens on the left, and that the top of the image is aligned to the top of the container, so no cropping at the top. This could be translated with 0%, 0%. So if we save this, we actually see no rocks at all, we see all the sky. On the other hand, we can set this to left bottom to say, well, left should be aligned and bottom. So now we will see all the rocks but less sky because no cropping is happening at the bottom. And you can even combine that with percentage values. So you could say to the left we want to crop 10%, to the bottom we want to crop 20%, for example. Now we will see some rocks, but a little bit less. It's moved down a bit. And this gives you full control over how you position your image. Now, for our page here, I think this setting is actually quite nice, so I will stick to that. Now, there is more you can set up regarding the background, so let's dive into the additional properties you can set in the next lecture. We had a first look at the background property. We used it with colors and we used it with our images. And the background property is a shorthand property, as you learned. Now, behind the scenes, we can split it up into several sub-properties, and we saw some of them. We got the background image color, position and size and repeat, but there also is background origin, clip, and attachment. Let's find out what all of these properties do. Well, background image, unsurprisingly, allows us to set one or, important, we didn't do that yet, but we'll do so soon, multiple background images. Background color can be used to, surprisingly, set a solid color as a background. Background position allows us to set the initial position relative to the background position layer. Now that will become important in a second. This will refer to the background origin here. And it only applies to the background image, because if you have a solid color, it will fill the entire container. That's it. You can't position that. Background size sets the size of the background image, also only refers to the background image, therefore. Background repeat defines how a background images are repeated, also referring to background image, therefore. And background origin allows us to set a background positioning area. Now we'll dive into what this means in the next lecture. It also is only relevant for background images. Background clip allows us to define whether the background extends underneath a potential border or not. So if it ends before the border or goes beneath it, important for dotted or dashed borders where you can actually see content below the border. And background attachment defines how the scrolling will behave inside of that image. So this also only refers to images. Here's an overview. Everything that's orangish refers to background image only. So now let's dive into that and let's see that in action and let's find out how this actually can be applied to our background. Let's start with background origin. It's a bit comparable to box sizing. The values you can assign are very similar, though there is an extra value. Let's temporarily comment this out, and let's also give our image a border temporarily, because this will help us understanding some of these additional properties. Let's give it a border of, let's say, 5 pixels, dashed, not solid, red. If we save that and we reload, we see that dashed border around our image. Now what you can see already, if you will watch closely, is that on the left and right, there is white space beneath the border. On the top and bottom, we actually see the image. The reason for this is that on the left and right, the images fit into the container, but as you can see, the border doesn't seem to be part of the container width. On the top and bottom, the border also isn't part of the container, but on the top and bottom, we actually have excess space on our image. So we crop it, and that in turn seems to happen after the border. Now that's exactly what we can control with properties like background origin. So if we set background origin to, for example, to border box, and we save and we reload, now you see the image also goes beneath or below the border on the left and right, because we now basically define what the container is for our background property. By default, it's not the border box, and therefore we have that white space. So what is the default then? Is it content box? Let's assign content box and reload. And now we see we even got some white space inside of our image, because if we hover over our section here, which holds the image, we see that it got some padding, that green area on the left and right and top and bottom. So content box, just as for box sizing, means the content without border and padding. So now the container, which defines the width and height of our image, is just the container without border and any padding. So the default actually is something we can't set on box sizing, the padding box. This means the container including content and padding, but not the border. Now I will change this to border box here to ensure that my image also goes beneath the border, even though we will remove that border later. Now, however, one other thing we can notice is that it always, no matter what we defined, went beneath the border for top and bottom, because there we were not talking about setting the height of the container, but we simply had the effect that we had excess image and we cropped it, but the cropping wasn't affected by background origin. This instead is set with background clip. Here we can also set it to border box. If we save that and we reload, get the same behavior as before. If we change it to padding box, however, and we now reload, now you see the border is empty, so no image beneath it, at the top and bottom too. So with background clip, we define where the image actually should be clipped if necessary. And now it's clipped after the padding. And of course, we could also set this to content to clip it before the padding. So now we got this white space around it. Please note that this now also affects the width. So the part where we don't clip it, but where we actually size it. If we set this back to padding box, we can also see this because to the left and right, the border now also has some white space beneath it. So background clip actually overrides background origin, you could say, and it's also important for defining how it should be, well, not just positioned and sized, but also how it should be clipped. And I will also set background clip and origin back to border box to have a nicer view. Now the last value we saw on the slides is background attachment. Now we won't actually see this in action here, and it's a property you rarely use. With that, you can define how scrolling would behave in a container that has a background image, but that is not fixed itself. Now this container here isn't fixed, but relative, but we can't scroll inside of it. And on the packages page, we would have a container where we can scroll in it, but the container itself is fixed to the page, so we also won't see effect there. Background attachment would allow you to set fixed, scroll, or local as a value. And this defines whether the image scrolls with the other content of the container. For local, that would be the case. For scroll, however, the image would stay in place and the content would scroll over it, above it. And for fixed, the image would not be fixed to the container, but to the viewport. So you should have an effect where if you scroll the entire page with the container where the image is inside, the image should stay in place. This is what you can do with background attachment. Again, a property you don't use that often in reality though. So these are all these sub-properties we can set for background. As you learned, most of them only apply to background images. Now with that, let's find out how we can bring all these sub-properties into one shorthand. So in the last lecture, we defined all these properties. Now let's put them into our shorthand here. Now we already saw how we can add an image or a solid color. Now what about the other properties? We can of course also set the positioning and size here. However, both can, for example, use pixels and percentage values. So how do we define what should be what? Well, actually, the position comes first and then is separated from the size with a slash. So what you can do is you can write left 10%, bottom 20%, just as we have it here, and then slash, forward slash, and then your size values. In this case, cover. If you do that, we should be able to comment out these three properties, save that, and if we reload, still have the same result as before. And we do. Now regarding the other properties, we can of course add no repeat. We got no other property that would have the same value, so that's no problem. Now for background, origin, and clip, we actually also have the same values, but here simply the order wins. If you only include one value, like border box, this will actually be set for both origin and clip. So for our case, this would do. You could also define both, like for example, border box and padding box, because defining two only makes sense if you have differing values. In this case, the first one would set the origin and the second one the clip. But here I will just use one because I want to set the same value. And of course, you could also add fixed, local, or scroll for background attachment. So with that, I can comment this out, reload my page, and still have the same effect as before. I will now also remove the border, which was only there for demo purposes. And with that, we got a nicely positioned image here, which looks way better than before. Now, with this changed and set into place, let's move on and let's find out what else we can do with images. In the last lectures, we worked a lot with background images. And for a good reason, because positioning background images really gives you a lot of flexibility. It's actually harder to style normal images, as you will see. So let's dive into that, because it's harder, but of course not impossible. Let's start with a logo for our page. Right now we only have text here. Why don't we use an image instead? For that, I'll go to my index.html file first of all. And here where I have uhost in my anchor tag, I'll actually add an image element. Now we can enter any alt text we want. Doesn't really matter for our styling here. So I'll name it uhost, your favorite hosting company. And now for the source, we need an image. Now attached to this video, you'll find the uhost icon, which I'll put into the images folder here. And I will also move my freedom image in there, by the way. And with that added, I first of all will quickly adjust the link here to freedom to images/freedom. But more importantly, in the index.html file, I'll now also link to my newly added icon here. So I'll add images/uhost icon.png. If we save all files and we reload, yeah, it's a relatively big icon, I'd say. At least we can clearly see it, but it might be a little bit too big for our page here. So we definitely need to style that, and that's exactly what I want to do in this video. I'll style it in the shared CSS file because it's part of our shared header. And now there, we can have a look at our brand styling. If we scroll through our existing styles, here is the main header, brand. Now we set a text color, a text decoration, and also font weight and size. Now actually, we can leave that in case the alt text is shown, but I want to change the way my image is displayed. Now one thing you could think is that we simply want to give it, let's say, a height of 22 pixels to be in line with our font size. If we do that and we reload our page, yeah, didn't have too much effect, did it? The reason is, and that's important, that by setting a height on a container, and keep in mind, main header brand is just the container, not the image element itself. By setting a height on the container, the image will not be affected. Because the default behavior, and that's really important now, the default behavior is if you enter an image tag and you point to an image, then the default height and width of the original image will be used and will be entered into your document, no matter which width and height you set for the surrounding element. So in our case here, if we have a look at our image, you see it has dimensions of 186 by 190. If we hover over the anchor tag, we actually can see on the left that the blue area is much smaller than that, but the image doesn't care. To make the image care, we can of course follow two routes. First of all, we need to select it. That's always the case. So let's use our main header brand class here, and then let's select the image. You could of course also add a class to the image. Here, I will simply use the descendant selector to select any images in main header brand. Now in there, we could of course also set a height of 22 pixels. If we do that and we reload, now we see the image is much smaller. Now besides doing that, what we could do is of course set 100%. This would mean it should take the height of the surrounding container, which happens to be our brand that sets the height of 22 pixels. However, this does not work. Height 100% on the image will again lead it to use its original height, not the height defined by the container. That's important to understand. So we should really set the final value we want to have on the image here. Now let's find out if that's also the case for the width. In case we're not setting the height, but let's say we're setting a width of 20 pixels on the surrounding container. If we set nothing on the image, nothing changes. If we go to the image and we set width to 100% and then we reload, also nothing changes. So percentage values on the image don't help us here because they don't respect the surrounding container. Now actually the reason for that simply is that our surrounding container is an inline element itself. It's just an anchor tag. If we set it to inline block instead, and now we reload, now the image does respect this container style. So it was not the image, but the fact that the anchor tag was not a block or inline block element. As soon as it is, we can use 100%. And of course, not just on the width, but also on the height. So this is important to understand with using images. It depends on whether you use it nested in an inline element, in which case 100% will simply use the default dimension, the default width or height of the image, or if you use it inside a block level element where it will use the container width or height. So now with that back, we now can set 100% as a height and it will use the height of our container here. So with that, we style the image, and this is about all we can do regarding styling already. All the fancy things we could do for background images with the different positioning modes and sizing modes, move cover and so on, are not really possible with normal images. You can always find some hacky solutions with negative paddings or margins to position the image in a certain way. For example, here, we could go to our image here and give it a margin top of, let's say, -5 pixels. And if we do that, then you see it was actually moved up a tiny bit. But that really is about it. And it's, as I said, also a bit hacky. Now, therefore, if you want to do some more complex styling on an image, I recommend using background image. The downside of background image just is, as it's not part of your normal document flow, it doesn't have its own HTML element that clearly signals that it's an image, it's worse for accessibility. So background images should really just be used as such, backgrounds. If you got an image in your normal document flow, you should go with the normal image, but then you often don't have to set more than the width or the height. Of course, you can still set anything else like borders and so on. I'm just talking about the positioning and sizing where you're limited. Regarding all the other things, you can of course set everything you want. So that was just a tiny exercise though. That was just our brand icon. We got that customers page, and there I actually want to have bigger images. So let's add this page in the next lecture. Let's add a customers page. And for that, let's first of all create a new folder in our project. I'll name it customers. And in there, I'll create another index.html file and a customers.css file. Now into that index.html file, copy the code of the file, the HTML file you find attached to this lecture, this content here. Now there, we already also have the import to customers CSS. So that is added right out of the box. Now we also need to add our header here though. So let's go to index.html and grab our entire header code from there and go to the customers page and add it here. By the way, let's also add the updated header with our image to our packages file. However, for that, let's first of all fix the images path here in the customers header. We need to go up one level to reach the images folder. And again, let's do the same for our other header. Actually, we just need to copy the image here, the header image. So let's go to the packages folder and replace our uhost text with the image there too. Make sure that the path is correct here too. So back into the customers file, we got the header. We got that main content I shared with that attached file. You see some text and you also see some image imports there. And we got the footer. Now regarding the image imports, you find two images attached to this video too, customer 1 and 2. Let's insert these into our images folder. And with that, the last thing I have to do is check if our links are correct. So on the main page, here, index.html, in the navigation, we should navigate for customers to the customers folder and the index.html file. And for packages, if we go there, we should go to, well, one level up and then into the customers folder. And from inside the customers page, in our header, we also need to adjust the links because we copied that in from our main page. For packages, we should go up one level and then go into the packages folder. For the brand, we should also go up one level and then navigate to index.html, so to our main HTML file. For customers, however, we can just target index.html because that's exactly the page we are on. And start hosting, well, we don't have that yet. We'll add it later. Just a quick check in packages. Okay, the brand link is okay. So with that, if we save all files and we reload the page, we should be able to go to customers now. And here we got our two customer testimonials. Awesome guys, they really like our service. And I like that we positioned them in a very prominent way, but maybe a little bit too prominent. Maybe we can do more with their images. Especially if we consider that I wasn't even zoomed in. So if I do zoom in, as I am on the rest of the pages, to make this more readable, yeah, then we really got some styling issues here. We don't even see our customers that well. Now, over the next lectures, we'll work on this page, mostly on the images, of course. So in the last video, we added our customers page. Now attached to this video, you'll find some starting CSS code, which you'll please enter into your customers CSS file. This code styles everything but the images. So what happens here in the end is just setting some margins, paddings, and some inline block display styles. That's all. If we save that, and with it we go back to our page, well, we don't see that many changes. The text changed, that's cool. The images still look the way they did before though, for a good reason, because we haven't changed their style. We'll do that together. So let's start working on these images then. What can we do with them? If we go back to our HTML code in the customers folder, we see for the images we already got a surrounding container, the testimonial image container, and the image itself also has a class of testimonial image. Both images have that set up. With that, we can go to our CSS file and let's maybe start with the container. So in the customers CSS file, I will add the testimonial image container below my testimonial first of type selector, which is a pseudo selector to ensure that the first testimonial has a margin top and the second one hasn't, because I don't want to have that much distance between the two testimonials, only towards the top. And with that testimonial image container class added here, we can of course start assigning styles to it. Let's also already grab the testimonial image class though, because we will have a hard time setting heights and widths without also changing the image itself. So we should definitely add testimonial image here. And let's now start assigning heights and widths. So for the image container, let's start with a width of 80%. Because if we have a look at our HTML code, the image container is sitting next to the info, and the info actually should not take up that much space. So if we set this width to 80%, and for the image itself we set it to 100%, we wouldn't see any effect unless we also set the container, the image container, to display inline block, as you learned over the last lectures. Then the image will respect the width of the parent. So with the width and display inline block added to the container and the width added to the image, let's reload the page now. And we indeed decreased the size of our images. So that's much better. Still, they don't fit into one line with our other text. Now, if we inspect that, however, so the testimonial info class that is, we see that it also does have the inline block display style. So theoretically, we could fit it into one line with our other image container. For that, however, we have to go to testimonial info and limit its width. So if I set a width of 20%, then we would run into that issue with inline block if it adds up to 100. So let's maybe set the image container to 70. If we now reload, now the text is next to the image. It's not a line in the middle, but it's next to it. Now, why does it have that strange positioning though? The reason for this simply is that our info container has vertical align middle. Our image container, which is its adjacent inline block element, doesn't have it, so it's not positioned correctly. If we assign vertical align middle to the image container 2 and we reload, now the text actually is positioned next to our testimonial image. Now maybe we want to play with the sizes again, increase the size of the info to let's say 30% and decrease the image container to 65. With that, if we reload, that looks a bit nicer. So now we already got quite a nice style. We can do more with that though. And by the way, also notice that of course right now our page is only partly responsive. For small screens this looks really awkward, and for big screens we got huge images. But this is something we can control once we reach the responsive design lectures. So with that we got a nice look on this layout, however. So what else can we do here? Well, how about a shadow behind these images? We can go to our image container now, because we want to add that shadow to the block level element, and add box shadow, and then maybe 3 pixels, 3 pixels, 3 pixels, and then RGBA 000.3 for a light grayish transparent shadow. If we now reload, our image does have that nice shadow, which looks all right. Now we also got that annoying white space at the bottom of the image though. This is simply an inline element bug. We can get rid of it by going to our testimonial image and setting vertical align on the image. Not on the container, but on the image to top or bottom. It will actually both work. Now with that, it gets rid of that white space. So that's a nice trick to keep in mind. If you got an image in a surrounding container, and the image of course is an inline element, you can get rid of that white space that's introduced to that inline element behavior by adding vertical align top. An alternative would be to set the image to display block. This would also fix it. It would turn it to a block level element and hence remove any white space after it. Both works. I'll use the vertical align top solution. Now with that, this looks quite nice in my opinion. Got a nice page here. Now one thing I notice is my footer doesn't work correctly. Let's quickly check this. Main footer is the class. but the main footer links class is missing. So let's quickly copy that from our other footer. Sorry about that. So let's quickly add the main footer links class to the unordered list and the main footer link class to the list items. If we save that and reload, this looks better. And now we got a nice customers page here. So this really looks all right. We got a nicely styled customers page with images that look better. However, what about that second image? Can't we improve the box shadow of that? It does have it. You can see it below the image. But wouldn't it be nice to have a little bit more box shadow on the left and right here too? We can actually add this by going back to the customer's CSS file and adding a fourth value to the box shadow, the spread. We can set this to 3 pixels too, and if we now reload, you see there's a tiny shadow to the left and top too, because spread simply defines how much the box shadow leaves its border, so how much it adds to the left, right, and top and bottom. So it spreads out a little bit, improving the look of this image in my opinion. Maybe we need more blur now. Yeah, this looks better. So this is the final state with which I want to end. This is how you add and style images. Now, keep in mind, background images actually give you more flexibility. You can position them easier, you can do more with them, but you should only use them for backgrounds because of accessibility. But as you saw in this video, styling images like this also is perfectly possible and can lead to nice looking pages. Again, the responsive part is something we'll extensively cover in the responsive layout section. Now that we had a closer look at images, let's move onwards to linear gradients. For that, I'll go back to my main.css file and that background image we have on the starting page. Let's say we want to add a linear gradient instead of that image. Later we'll also combine it with the image, but for now let's use just the linear gradient. The first important thing you gotta know is that gradients, both linear and radial ones, are treated as images. So if you were to use the sub properties and not the shorthand, you would add a gradient by targeting background image with it, and then the part which I'll teach you in a second. Or in the shorthand version, you simply add it instead or additional to images because you can have multiple background images, not just one, but more about multiple backgrounds also at a later part. For now, let's simply override the background we set here with a linear gradient. We add one by using the linear gradient function CSS ships with. Now the linear gradient function consists of 2 parts in the end. You can add more than 2 arguments, but that simply is because you can define multiple colors across which you want to transition. But the first argument always is the direction of the gradient. You can omit it, in which case the first argument would be a color. So the simplest possible gradient is red-blue, for example. And if you save that, you get a gradient from red to blue. As you see, the default is vertically. So by default, it simply is a perfect line from top to bottom, and it transitions from red smoothly to blue. Now I just mentioned the first argument can be a color, but normally it's the direction. You can, for example, specify it like this, to bottom. This looks strange at first, but this is a syntax understood by CSS. It simply means that, from top to bottom. So you can save this and reload, and you get the same result as before. You can also say to left bottom. And now it will be a diagonal. Now you see it starts in the top right and goes to the left bottom. That's the transition. Of course, as you might guess, you could say to left top, to right top, and so on. And this simply defines where your colors start and where they go to. Now you can also define an angle with degrees. So you could say 30 degrees. And now your transition or your gradient would have a 30-degree angle. Now if you set it to 0 degrees and you reload, you start at the bottom actually. So unlike the default where you start at the top, 0 degrees simply means a perfect line coming from the bottom. Therefore, 180 degrees would be your default where you start at the top. And you can, of course, define any angle you want or use that to left bottom notation. Now, besides that, you can also define multiple colors, as many as you want, basically. So you can also add green, yellow, and orange here. Of course, you can not just use color names, you can also use hex codes. For example, for orange, you could also use that hex code here. And the same is true for RGB or HSL functions. You could use these too. So with that, if you now reload, we got a really colorful gradient. Now, I don't know if you need that on your next website, but it's nice to know that you can build that. A special gradient or a special way of using gradients is to also implement transparency. For example, you could transition from red to transparent. And if you do that, well, then you actually see we fade out to transparent, so we see whatever the background behind the gradient is. This is very useful for cases where you do have multiple backgrounds on top of each other. More on that later. You can, of course, also transition to a RGBA color, for example, like this, with some transparency inside of it. Now we would transition from red to this transparent black-gray color. This is how you can use linear gradients. You can do even more than that, though. Besides specifying multiple colors, you can also define where these colors should start and stop. So let's add another color, let's say blue. And if you reload right now, you see each color gets 1/3 of the gradient. It's not that good to see because we go to that transparent gray, but actually the red color ends after 1/3, or put in other words, after 1/3, or after 30% to be precise, we got a perfect blue. And then after further 30%, that ends and we transition into the black part. Now you can split this up. You could, for example, say red should stay until 70%. Now if you reload, 70% of the gradient is red, a perfect red I should say, and then it transitions into blue and then the other color. Of course, you can also define stops here too. You could say 80% blue. This simply now means that after 80% of the gradient, the blue will already be done. If you enter a value smaller than the 70% of the red here, and you then reload, you see you got simply a hard edge because there's no room for transition, because when the blue part enters, it's already too late, to put it like this. It should have started at 60%, well, it can only start after 70, but therefore there is no smooth transition. So this is how you can play around with the colors and how you can control when which color transitions into what. This is the linear gradient. We also got the radial gradient. Let's take a closer look at that in the next lecture. You saw the linear gradient in the last lecture. Let's comment it out. And let's add another background image, this time with the radial gradient function. The radial gradient function, as the name suggests, allows you to define a radial gradient. So not one that starts at one edge and goes to another one, but one that starts at a certain shape and then transitions to all the areas around it. Let's start with a simple gradient again, red, blue, because we can clearly see that. If we reload, this is our default radial gradient. It's positioned in the middle by default, and the shape is an ellipse. It's not a circle, it's an ellipse. And you see it starts with the first color and then transitions to the second color, which is all around it. Of course, here too, you can define multiple colors like green. And the shape will simply, well, be kept. And now we have a red ellipse going to a blue ellipse going to a green ellipse. This is how that works. Now, of course, you can also change the shape. For example, you can add a first argument that can be circle. That's the alternative, the only alternative you have to the ellipse. You can set it to be a circle instead of an ellipse. If you now reload and watch closely, you see it now indeed is a perfect circle, no longer an ellipse. Now, of course, you can also change the position where it should start. Right now it was always centered, but maybe you don't want that. You can add the at attribute here and say at top, for example. If you do that and you reload, Now you see the center of the circle is right in the middle of the top. You can also say add top left to put it to the top left. Now the center of the circle is in the top left. And then the radial gradient starts from there. You can also enter custom values here. You could say 20%, 50%. If you do that, you actually see it's moved 20% from the left. So the circle of the innermost shape is 20% from the left and 50% from the top. So this is basically how you know it. First value is the x-axis, second value is the y-axis. Of course, you can also use pixels here. Now with that, we got the shape and we got the position. Now what's missing? The missing piece, of course, is the size. You can define the size by, for example, adding 20 pixels after a circle. If you do that and you reload, now you see the circle is very tiny because now, and that's important, the entire circle without the outermost part, so in this case the red and the blue area, have a total combined diameter of 20 pixels. So that's basically the width of this shape. Now this only works for the circle, for the ellipse. If you use that, which would be the default, this actually doesn't work because what would the 20 pixels be referring to? Of course, you could add 2 values here and reload. Now you again created a circle though. So you could add different values to turn this back to a non-circle. So with 2 values, you can also style the ellipse, give it a certain width and height, like that. First value is width, second value is height. But there also are some keywords in case you don't want to do it like that. You can also add something like farthest side. Now what does this do? Watch the current value and then reload. Now what this actually means, and you can barely see it, that the ending shape, and that simply means until it transitions to the outermost color, so in case of 2 colors after the first color, or in case after 3 colors as we have it here after the second color, that the ending shape, and you can barely see it, the outer rings of the blue color touch the farthest side, so the side furthest away from the center, from the position of the element. This barely touches this side. And on the other hand, you would have closest side to reduce the size. Now, the outermost circle of the blue color, and again, it's hard to see, but you can see there is still some non-perfect green part here. This touches the closest side. And it also considers top and bottom, by the way. And you can also not use the sides, but the corners. Closest corner, for example, ensures that the outermost ring touches the closest corner. And on the other hand, farthest corner allows you to control that it touches the farthest corner. So these are some great defaults you can use to control the size of your radial gradient. And that's actually all that's to it. What you can still do is you can define color stops, like blue after 70%. You can do that to change, well, where it should transition to green and so on. But besides that, it behaves like the linear gradient. You can define multiple colors, you can use hex codes, you can use color functions, and so on. And that is how you can use a radial gradient. Now, just as linear gradients, they are added as background images, and they can be stacked. Now let's dive into that stacking part in the next lecture. So we had a look at gradients, and I did mention that we can use multiple backgrounds. So how does this look like? For the background shorthand, or also with multiple background image and color assignments, we can set multiple backgrounds for one and the same element. This of course only makes sense if the backgrounds have some form of transparency to them, be that images with transparent parts or gradients with transparent colors. Otherwise, you will only see the topmost background. But you can add multiple backgrounds. Important though, only one solid color can be used, and it will always be the bottommost background. You can use how many background images you want to use though. You're not limited regarding that. You can add multiple background images, and keep in mind, gradients count as images. So let's see this in action in our project. Back there on the starting page, I'll get rid of the ugly radial gradient and I'll reintroduce the shorthand with the image. Now I will use a background color of gray, like as a fallback, or maybe our red color actually, which we had before. So that's a fallback in case the image can't be loaded. And I also want to add a linear gradient. Now we can add a linear gradient with the linear gradient function here, and it will be stacked on top of that image because I write it prior to that image. So you'll read it left to right basically. Now one important thing though, your different background images have to be separated with commas, and so you do have to do for the background color. And that even shouldn't come here, because after the color here, we got a couple of important properties which position that image. And they would refer to that background color right now. Actually, this would be a syntax error. So what we have to do is remove that solid color and add a comma after our other shorthand properties. Because you separate your different layers with commas, and the solid color is no exception from that rule, and then you can set the other shorthand properties for that given background. So you can set, and you would have to set, different background properties for the linear gradient, because these ones here only apply to that image. So every comma-separated list has its own set of background properties, so to say. Now for the first background, I only want to have the gradient though, so this doesn't matter, but that is why the positioning is important and why the commas are important. Back to that gradient. For this gradient, I want to transition to the top, so I want to start at the bottom. And I want to go from a light transparent gray to a fully transparent look. So I will start with RGBA, and then I will use 80, 68, 18. That will be a brownish grayish color, which fits the general color theme of the image, to a fully transparent look. But here I also add 60% opacity only, so that we have some transparency. And then again, I go to full transparency. Now we'll also add a color stop. So before the comma, after my RGBA function, I'll add 10% so that I don't have an even transition, but that I leave my color here relatively early. With that, if we save that and we reload, we actually see that the bottom now also has this light golden brownish look. To make this even clearer, let me temporarily set this to 0 to have a fully transparent element here. Now we're back to the original black here for the bottom. And now let's revert this to .6. Now if I reload, you see we have that golden touch here at the bottom too. And that's the look I wanted. And here you see both a linear gradient in action, as well as the stacking of backgrounds in action. Again, this only makes sense as either a fallback, as here for our solid color, or if your topmost backgrounds have some transparent elements. Otherwise, well, you won't see the background beneath them. And that's it for the backgrounds. We had a detailed look at gradients, and now also at that very important stacking where the syntax matters. If you use the shorthand, use the commas, don't forget them, and assign the properties to the background you want to assign them to. Each background has its own set of background properties. And if you don't set them, the defaults will be used. Enough about backgrounds, gradients, and images. Let's talk about filters. What is a filter? Here's a div element. It doesn't have any content, but let's say it has some styles that turn it into a box we can see by adding a background color, brown maybe, and also width and height. Left out here, but let's say it has this. Then we would see a box which looks like that. Now we can add a filter with the filter property and use one of the predefined filter functions to change the look of that element and its content. For example, the blur filter would take a pixel value and would blur the box. That is what filters are. They allow us to change the visual appearance of an element by applying a filter like blurring, grayscale, or changing the contrast. A list of all available filters can be found in the last lecture of this module, but for now, let's simply see a filter in action. Here I'm on the MDN page for the filter property, and there you actually see all the available filter functions and how to configure them. You can easily add shadows, change the brightness, or invert the colors, change the opacity with filters. Though therefore, filters are a quick and easy way of changing the visuals of something, and you can also apply more than one filter, as you can see. Now let's simply see this in action, and let's apply a filter. I want to do this on our packages page. There, if you go to our app, packages, we got a background image already. Now that background image could receive a tiny filter. To see that filter, however, I'll first of all change the positioning to center/cover so that we can see more of the image. Now we see it's actually a quite colorful image with that green plant. Now let's remove some of that color and let's add a tiny grayscale. You could of course also blur it, but that might be hard to your eyes in the end. So let's add a tiny grayscale, and for that, in the packages CSS file, on the background class selector, I'll add the filter property. And here I'll use the built-in grayscale function. Again, you can see a list of all available functions in that resource attached to the next lecture, or you find in the next lecture. The grayscale function takes a percentage, defining how much we want to turn it to gray. 100% is the maximum. If we enter that and we reload, we got a fully grayscale image as a background. We can do that, but I don't want to go as far. So maybe 40% looks good here. So if we take 40% and we reload, now we still got some color, but it's a little bit more grayish. And of course, feel free to play around with that and possibly add more filters to other parts of this app if you want to. This is how easy you can use the filter property. As you can see, really not that difficult to use. Now, one important word about compatibility. If you scroll down to the end of that MDN article about the filter, where you see plenty of examples, by the way, if you do scroll down to the very bottom, you see the browser compatibility, and there you see that basic support for filters is missing in Internet Explorer. It's available in Edge, but not in the Internet Explorer. So if you still have to support that, you might not be able to use filter, or you have to use a polyfill, or implement some other fallback, or only use filter in cases where it doesn't matter if it doesn't get applied, where it just enhances the look, but doesn't do something it absolutely depends on. So this is the filter property. Browser compatibility is something to keep in mind, but other than that, it's awesome. We're almost done for the module. We worked a lot with images in this module, do you remember? Now, one popular form of images or icons is SVG, for Scalable Vector Graphics. Now, SVG is a topic for its own. You can dive very deep into it, and there are whole courses diving just into SVG graphics. Attached to this video, you find free files for SVG graphics we can add to our key features area of our main page. If you go to the main page, I'm talking about these circles here. Now let's enter the first SVG graphic inside of the key feature image container. Simply copy the SVG code into there. And yes, it's quite a lot, but you can use it inline like this. Browser support for this is very decent. Now let's do the same for the two other SVGs you can find attached to this video here. Let's grab the second one and enter it into the second key feature image container. And let's also do that for the third. And depending on your IDE, you can always simply reduce that so that the content still is there but doesn't occupy your entire HTML file. If you do that and you reload, you see the icons are added, but actually they're a little bit too big. Now you can style SVG too. This is exactly what I want to do with you now. However, we will not dive into the depths of styling SVG, because as it turns out, you can even select the SVG elements themselves and start styling these. So you could go in there and start styling the colors of the SVG lines and so on by overriding that fill color here. This is something a bit more advanced and more related to SVGs than CSS. Therefore, what I want to do is I'll go to the main.css file And there, let's scroll down to our key features area. Now we got that key feature image part here. And let's simply add a padding in there of, let's say, 20 pixels. Now if we do that and we reload, this looks much better. Now to still give you an idea of how you could style SVG though, let's use the developer tools and let's select an element here. As you can see, we can select the individual parts of that SVG image. For example, that orange branched line here. Now as you see, the style here is set with inline styles. Because I didn't create these SVGs on my own, I got them from an external source, and there they were exported like this. We can still override this either with the important mark or anyways here in the developer tools. And what I want to show you right now is just that we got some extra properties there. Most importantly, the fill property, which defines how this element is filled, but also the stroke property to add an extra stroke. Maybe black. Now you see there's a tiny black stroke around this orange line. You can also add a stroke width property to set it to, let's say, 10 pixels so that we can clearly see it here on the left. This is just a brief introduction to how you can style CSS. Fill and stroke are the most important properties there. You could translate them kind of with background color, and border width. However, if you want to learn more about this, at the end of this module, you'll find an article which dives a bit deeper into this. Again, a dedicated SVG course is what you should be looking for if you want to dive deeper into styling SVGs. For now, this style should do. And I have to say, I like the look of our page already. This looks awesome. We greatly enhanced it over the course of this module with all these background styles, with all these images, and now also these SVGs. And with that, I'd say, let's just move on and let's keep on improving this project further. So that's it for the module. What did we learn? We had a detailed look at the background property with all its sub-properties and also how you could combine them into the background shorthand. Important, watch out for position and size, which should be separated with a slash. Also, make sure you separate multiple backgrounds correctly with commas. And as for all shorthands, you should always remember that you override other properties when setting a shorthand. Because the shorthand, even if you only use it to define a URL, will also initialize default values for all the other sub-properties. So if you add a shorthand as the last declaration in a rule, and you set background position, let's say earlier, this will actually be overwritten by the default implied by the shorthand notation. We then had a look at gradients, at linear and radial gradients, and how you could control color stops, shape, position, and size of the gradients. We had a look at multiple backgrounds, how you can stack them, how the syntax works, and that you can only have one solid color but multiple images, and that gradients count as images, and that you can use transparency to create cool effects. We also had a look at how we can style images, and I also did a brief comparison to background images and mentioned the accessibility problem we have with background image, which on the other hand has or comes with an advantage of giving us more flexibility. Not the accessibility problem gives us that advantage, but background image in general. Still, only use it for real backgrounds. That's my recommendation. You'll learn how you can control the image sizing and positioning and styling in this module too. And finally, we had a look at filters. Another awesome way of adding visual effects to elements. Just keep the browser compatibility in mind. If you need to support Internet Explorer, you should provide fallbacks, use a polyfill, or don't use them at all. And that's actually it for backgrounds and images and all that fun stuff.